So when we talk about things like treaties, we'll talk a little bit. We talked a little bit about this. That what one party thought they were signing and what another party thought they were signing are actually two different things. We see that same issue when we start talking about confederation and an idea about what idea underlies the idea of like what the point of confederation and what the intention of confederation is. And we see sort of some very, very, very similar challenges in this sort of space. So there's a vision of confederation that sets up the Canadian Confederation as a partnership of nations. As in, confederation is the document that is created when an Anglophone and a Francophone nation sit down to figure out how we're going to work together and live together and interact with each other. Okay, um, there are some challenges with that perception, right? Um, notably, that it's really weird to talk about a partnership of nations in the Confederation documents when you left out all of the indigenous people and their nation to nation agreements with the crown. That's a whole other story, but in this sort of context, there's this idea about a partnership of nations, largely between a Francophone and an Anglophone nation. And if that's what you believe Confederation is, it has a number of consequences for what you expect and what you accept in later aspects of that relationship. So, what you think is appropriate, what you think is inappropriate. We will get into some of those conversations about what the expectation was on one side. But another way of looking at Confederation as a project is to think about Confederation as a strategy of containment, i.e., a way to sort of look at the political structures of Canada and say, right, Confederation is a way for us to take the influence of the Francophone Canadians from 50% of Canada sort of prior to 1867, right? Because you have equal legislative assemblies in Canada East and Canada West. So you have the Francophone and Anglophone legislative bodies that are exactly the same size and have the same power. So Confederation, in that perspective, can be seen as a way of limiting the influence of the Francophone population because now, instead of having two votes that are important, right? Canada and like Canada East and Canada West, the Anglophone and the Francophone ones, you are adding Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI, which means that you have four Anglophone votes to the one Francophone vote. So you have this potential to sort of drown them out. Um, and that is an important sort of aspect to understand in that if you expect Confederation to be a form of containing a Francophone influence, then you're going to act and expect a number of different things sort of going forward and what sort of your ideal and acceptable futures look like. So that's sort of an important piece. What I really want you to think about though is not so much those ideas and figuring out which one is right, because that's not a question we can meaningfully answer in a lot of ways. But I want you to think about what happens and what actions you take if you believe one or the other, right? If you fundamentally believe that the Canadian Confederation was designed as a partnership of nations, what do you do afterwards? If you fundamentally think that the Canadian Confederation was a strategy to contain a Francophone influence, what do you do next? Okay, and those are sort of perspectives that are really, really important. Another sort of aspect of like what we were trying to do with Confederation when we created it is to create a sort of sense of national unity. And I mention that idea about national unity because what that unity looks like really varies based on which of those approaches to like what Confederation is you are taking, right? If you take the idea that this is a partnership of nations, then that unity looks like a sort of peaceful coexistence where you consult both nations before you make decisions, and there's a lot of sort of that cooperative peace. If you think that you're looking for unity, but you expected Confederation to be a sort of form of containment, then you're really looking at something different, right? You're expecting unity to look a lot more like homogeneity and a lot less like cooperation. So there's that kind of piece as well. I should probably mention this. I just sort of remembered that I did not say this, but when it comes to why people join Confederation, I will say that that sort of like contain the Francophones strategy is really important to Canada West, and by and large the Maritimes are not super impressed by it. Like, they don't care. If you look, like the Maritime provinces of Canada already had the experience of having a significant Francophone population. There was a relatively long period of time where Francophone and Anglophone settlers coexisted in that space. You're not talking necessarily about like strong ethnic tensions in that area, so that's an issue and that's something that we need to consider. It's also really important to highlight that Indigenous Canada is totally excluded from our conversations around Confederation. Like, there's no discussion of what Indigenous people might like in terms of creating a political entity that is now called Canada. They don't talk about it. And when we start talking about disagreements around conceptualizations, right, those disagreements around what Confederation is are very much the same as when we sort of talk about disagreements around what treaties are, right? If treaties are a partnership of nations, then there are a number of things that fall out of that assumption. If treaties are a strategy to contain the influence of Indigenous people and to sort of eventually lead to their assimilation, then you have a different set of consequences coming out of the same documents. So when there are disagreements about what those documents are, whether we're talking about Confederation or treaties, you wind up with sort of some long-term ethnic tensions in a lot of ways that are really hard to articulate. Because in a lot of ways they come not around, I say X and you say Y, but we're both supposed to be responding to document A, but I think document A is supposed to do this, and you think document A is supposed to do that. And those differences are often really, really difficult to sort of understand. Because they're based on assumptions. And they're based on assumptions that become implicit, that you don't really think about, right? If you're British and you figure that eventually everyone's just going to adapt to your superior way of life, then you don't really need to articulate and to sort of spell out Confederation is a strategy for assimilating the Francophone population, and eventually we really expect that they're going to become more and more like the British, and eventually their distinct cultural nature will disappear. Like, you're not going to articulate that because you don't think you have to, because for you take that sort of position for granted. That sort of tension around what Confederation is supposed to do also leads to a lot of tensions about the rights of a Francophone and Catholic population in Canada outside of Quebec. So this is the conversation about what rights do and do not do the Métis population of Canada have. What rights do they have that sort of is connected to Indigenous heritage? What rights do they have connected to linguistic rights? That's a really complicated question, and one of the reasons it's complicated is because of a disagreement about whether or not we're talking about Canada as a partnership between nations or as a partnership to sort of contain a Francophone influence. This is also sort of the root of challenges around the Manitoba schools question, which we're going to talk about in a little while, but it also sort of bleeds into Alberta. There's a Supreme Court case not terribly long ago where essentially an Alberta Francophone took the Alberta government to court because he could not sort of get a traffic ticket in French, and there's a whole kind of conversation about whether or not you can use French as a language of expression in the legislative building in Edmonton. Like, can you use that on the floor of the House? All of these sort of things are important challenges in that. And in a lot of ways, we're like, that question about what do you do with Francophones who are already not living in Quebec, right? St. Albert already exists in 1867, and it's St. Albert. It's a Francophone and Catholic community at this point in time. This is an issue that exists in 1867, and it's something that we're still trying to resolve with the Official Languages Act in 1969 and with the substantial revision to the Official Languages Act that comes in 1988. We're going to talk a little bit about those when we get to sort of federal bilingualism later in this unit, but before we do that, we have to talk about a little bit of war history, specifically the two conscription crises for World War I and World War II, which are our next videos.